the preservation of and increased access to the 92nd Street Y Humanities Audio Archives is generously funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities.
I'm Mary Ann Riley. I'm producer of the About Women lecture series here at the Y and assistant director of the Tours and Talks department. And tonight, here to introduce our lecturer, who is Louise Kaplan, we're very lucky to have Martha Lear, who probably many of you know as the author of The Child Worshippers and Heart Sounds. Ms. Lear is former editor of the New York Times Sunday magazine and currently working on her first novel. Thank you very much for coming to join us.
Good evening. Let me make it pristinely clear, not formerly editor of the New York Times Magazine, an editor. There are worlds of difference. I thought that I had lost my glasses and I panicked because I would have been up the creek with my notes, but then I realized that in fact most of what I wanted to say about tonight's speaker I didn't need my notes for, but I'm glad to have them. Louise Kaplan is, the first thing I think I'd like to say about her is that she's a darling. The second thing I'd like to say about her, in order of ascending or descending importance, depending on your point of view, is that in literary terms, she's something of a rare bird. She is a psychoanalyst who writes books for a lay audience, such as most of ourselves, books which are psychoanalytically oriented, which are most respected by her peers, her colleagues, which are critically acclaimed in the journals of review, and which happen also to be, by some alchemy of prose and concept that I suppose is clear only to her, happen also to be great fun to read. As you all know, that is not necessarily true of books by psychoanalysts. At their best, such books, when they're written for lay audiences, may inform us. We may find ourselves illuminated about aspects of human behavior, but we very rarely find ourselves having a good time reading them. With Louise's books, you do. We belong to a group or a circle. It's terribly informal, and I'm not sure what to call it. It's kind of a club, it's kind of a gang of women writers who meet once a month in each other's homes. This has been going on for some years. We do have a name. We call ourselves with that deft, light-handed, slyly self-deprecating, subtle irony. We call ourselves the Lady Sewing Circle Writers Group. Sometimes we talk about the profession of writing, but more often we just talk. And we talk a hell of a lot, and we have a wonderful time. And at these meetings over the years, I came to love Louise Kaplan's social style long before I knew anything about her professional style. I invariably found her funny, charming, earthy, awesomely perceptive right off the cuff, and fully and generously accessible. And then I read one of her books and found to my delight that she was exactly the same on the printed page. And then last fall, I heard her give a paper to a professional audience on an aspect of the same subject she's going to discuss this evening. And I was enchanted by the paper and by her take on the subject, which had a wit and an intellectual elegance that I've come to expect of Louise, and which is why I'm particularly pleased to introduce her this evening. Some background. Dr. Kaplan is a nationally recognized, as the phrase goes, but it's accurate, a nationally recognized authority on the problems of adolescence. She has written extensively on the psychoanalytic theories of childhood, adolescence, and adulthood. Two of her books, the titles are Oneness and Separateness and Adolescence, The Farewell to Childhood, are both classics. And I suppose I could say that she is internationally recognized because both those books have been published in many languages and in many, many countries. She has been an associate professor on the faculty of the clinical psychology programs at New York University and the City University of New York. This is the part I'm happy to have the glasses for. While at NYU, she was director of the Mother-Infant Research Nursery, and at CUNY, she was director of Child and Adolescent Clinical Services. She is on the faculty of the Chicago Institute of Psychoanalytic Psychology, and she conducts workshops and clinical seminars at psychoanalytic institutes around the country. Her most recent book, published 2 years ago, is called The Family Romance of the Imposter Poet Thomas Chatterton, in which she explores the very mysterious story of an extraordinary adolescent, the young 18th century poet Thomas Chatterton, and explores that story through psychoanalytic interpretation, a highly original interpretation of which the New York Times wrote that, quote, "It is fascinating and often highly illuminating to watch her work it out in detail," close quote. And she's very recently completed the book upon which tonight's paper is based. It's a book called Female Perversions, The Temptations of Emma Bovary. I love the title. It will be published next January. She brings to that subject all the grace and freshness of perception that she seems, in my experience, to bring to everything, and so I'll introduce her so that you can see that for yourself. Dr. Louise Kaplan.
I'm just going to begin after that introduction. I'll just start. Yeah, I'm going to fix the mic so that you can hear me. All right. Except for sexual masochism, where the ratio is approximately 20 males to 1 female, less than 1% of all the cases cited as sexual perversion have been of females. Upon hearing these statistics, some people, usually the males, are offended at this suggestion that females might somehow have an edge on males. They insist that I have been taken in by statistics, which, as we know, always lie. Others, usually females, are happy with this evidence of the moral superiority of females. They admonish me for wanting to question that females are less perverse than males. And so no sooner are questions raised about these odd statistics than an array of stock responses is marshaled to explain them away. A favorite tactic is to undermine the statistics by presenting a list of all the exceptions to the rule. Women who have the same perversions as men. Women who participate vicariously in perversion by, quote, submitting unwillingly to the deviant sexual demands of men. People insist there are more perverse women than the doctors realize. In fact, women are just as perverse as men. And all doctors have to do is look around them, and those odd statistics would even out. Another standard response is to side with the statistics, but then to argue, for example, that women do not have to resort to perversion since they are given ample opportunity to vent their aberrant sexual desires on their children. A more carefully considered argument, but one that assigns an inordinate weight to biological factors, is that males are androgen, testosterone-driven, and therefore possessed by the urgencies of enabling and maintaining erections, whereas females, because of their estrogen restraint, genital inwardness, and delicacy of human relatedness, are less inclined toward perverse acting out as a solution to their sexual and moral dilemmas. In this standard argument, the premise is that the statistics on perversion are correct, and yet another proof of all the differences between males and females that we always like to attribute to biology and anatomical destiny. Still another reason offered for these unbalanced sex ratios in perversion is that men must have erections to perform sexually and therefore cannot hide their genital anxieties and inadequacies, whereas women, as we all know, are pretty good at faking sexual arousal and orgasm. That's an argument, that's not me. Women don't have to employ fetishes and such to prove their sexual adequacy. Indeed, women do not have to employ prostitutes to get beaten and dominated because men will gladly do it for free. Another response based on the mistaken assumption, and this is the key really here, that the perversions are spontaneous erotic adventures, quote, kinky sex, undertaken in the spirit of sexual liberation, is that women would be as perverse as men if they were granted greater sexual freedom. Now, whatever truth is conceded to these standard responses, they all miss the crucial point of the perverse strategy. The identifying mark of a perversion is a psychological strategy that uses one or another social stereotype of masculinity and femininity in a way that deceives the onlooker about the unconscious meanings of the behaviors she or he is observing. The perverse strategy works upon us immediately by using popular and traditional definitions of perversion to distract us from the truth. What is a perversion? To most people, including most psychiatrists and psychologists, the term perversion implies an irresistible attraction towards some abnormal, deviant, or bizarre sexual behavior. And very likely the first perversion that comes to everybody's mind is SM, sadomasochism, kinky sex, entailing bondage, whips, chains, and black leather boots. And therefore, let me state at the outset that the essential ingredient in perversion is not the kinky sex of bondage and leather boots, nor is perversion the exotic veilings and unveilings of the genitals in a striptease, the performances of oral or anal sex, sexual intercourse with partners of the same sex, telephone masturbation, any of these variations of erotic experience that loving or hating sexual partners may engage in at one time or another, if they so choose, or not, if that is their choice. What distinguishes perversion is its quality of desperation and fixity. A perversion is performed by a person who has no other choices, a person who would otherwise be overwhelmed by anxieties, depression, or even psychosis. The male perversions use some manifest form of kinky sex to prevail over these otherwise devastating emotional states. And therefore, the kinky sex in a male perversion is only a parody of adventurism. It is actually an appeasement of personal demons. Now, the perverse strategy operates in the same way for males and females, and what makes all the difference between the male and female perversions is the social gender stereotype that is brought into the foreground. Sexual behavior per se, kinky or otherwise, are not the key to the female perversions. Since females use other sorts of behaviors, one could say other sorts of deceptions, to appease their internal demons. My general thesis is that perversions, insofar as they derive much of their emotional force from social gender stereotypes, are as much pathologies of gender role identity as they are pathologies of sexuality. And there is always a subtle collaboration between the individual unconscious with its infantile gender attributions and the structures of the social order with its primitive notions of masculinity and femininity. Socially normalized gender stereotypes are the crucibles of perversion. Therefore, in locating the female perversions, I am directing attention to some socially normalized gender stereotypes of femininity. For this evening's talk, I will be focusing on the female perversion, extreme sexual submissiveness, or as it was first labeled in the late 19th century by Krafft-Ebing, Hurigkeit, or sexual bondage. And this is very different from sexual masochism, as you will see. Krafft-Ebing was certain that sexual bondage in females was not a perversion, but it was he who first made the distinction between the perversion of sexual masochism that is more typical of males and the behavior of sexual submissiveness that is typical of females. About women, Krafft-Ebing declared, quote, "The instinct of female servitude is everywhere discernible," close quote. That's a quote from Krafft-Ebing. Quote, "In women, voluntary subjection to the opposite sex is a physiological phenomenon. Owing to her passive role in procreation, ideas of subjection are in women normally connected with the idea of sexual relations. They form, so to speak, the harmonies which determine the tone quality of feminine feeling." Close quote. "For men," said Krafft-Ebing, "love is only an episode, whereas for women, who after all have no other important interests, love for a man is the principal and central focus of their lives until they have children. And to retain a man's love, a woman will make all concessions necessary to a male and willingly plunge herself into deeper and deeper bondage to him. And all of this, thought Krafft-Ebing, comes quite naturally to women." Now, based on these misconceptions about the instinctive basis of female submissiveness, Krafft-Ebing made his final and fatal error. Unlike the male perversion, sexual masochism, he said, sexual bondage is not a perversion. In fact, it is not even pathological. The elements from which it arises, love and weakness of the will, are not perverse, they're simply feminine. The sexual bondage of women, and that is simply an aberration of a normal female trait, is abnormal, but not perverse, Krafft-Ebing insisted, not pathological. Now, Krafft-Ebing's ideas on these matters, quaint as they seem, are still prevalent. Males, it is said today, and masculine women are predisposed to sexualizing love, whereas normal feminine females are predisposed to pure love and the weakness of the will that leads them into sexual bondage. Now, not by chance, as I was beginning to think about my new book, Female Perversions, I chose to read Madame Bovary and discovered there in one form or another, directly or indirectly, in every character and every turn of the plot, the personal and social factors that facilitate the perverse strategy. And since I would not use my own patients to illustrate what I was discovering, I was very happy to discover Flaubert's penchant for creating perverse scripts. Emma Bovary, a fictional female character created by a male whose writings expressed his condemnation of the gender stereotypes of his day, will be the central focus of this talk. But I will also be referring to the way in which the perverse strategy manifested in the life of Edith Wharton. Emma Bovary's transgressions, her refusal to submit to the prescriptive normalities of a provincial housewife, were expressed in her determination to find herself in another feminine stereotype. She would become a slave of love. As with any perverse script, beneath the surface of Emma's fictional history, we shall find the unexpected in places where we least expect them to exist. We begin, though, as we must, with the surface, as Emma searches for the meaning of her own life by surrendering herself entirely to Rodolphe Boulanger. Her love for him is everything she has ever dreamed of, so immense that she imagines it could bring the stars to tears. And how little deserving Rodolphe is of poor Emma's slavish adoration. He was a hard-hearted man, and because he had spent a lot of time in the company of women, he was coldly calculating in his evaluation of Emma. He was devoid of any capacity to appreciate a yearning soul reaching for the stars, and all he could hear were her trite words of love. For Rodolphe Boulanger, Emma Bovary is just another bored housewife, quote, longing to live in town and dance the polka every night, poor little woman, gasping for love, like a carp on a kitchen table, gasping for life. 3 flattering words and she'll adore me, I'm sure. How tender and charming it will be. But how will I get rid of her later? Close quote. How unlike Emma he was. Emma, who would dare to sneak away from her marriage bed and snoring husband, knowing that she was protected from the villagers' eyes only by the misty dawn. Emma, who would dash breathlessly through the muddy countryside, setting up wooden planks along the way to protect her pretty boots, and all for just 1 hour of Rodolphe's caresses. Emma, who was willing to risk all to breathe life into her illusions, but Rodolphe, on the other hand, was one of those who always hold themselves back from any and all involvement. And when the actual woman beneath the rustling petticoats begins to show, a man like Rodolphe cannot sustain his interest. And then the novelty of Emma's innocence fell away, quote, little by little, like articles of clothing, close quote. Her charm, quote, revealed in all its nakedness the eternal monotony of passion, which always assumes the same forms and speaks with the same tongue. When Emma declares her passion, I am your servant, she says to Rodolphe, your mistress. You are my king, you are my idol, you are good, you are so handsome, so intelligent, so strong. Her phrases are to him no different from those of his past mistresses. Rodolphe can only assume that Emma's surrender is the same dreary feminine fakery. The bored housewife is a garden variety siren. These women are all the same underneath. If you've seen them one, you've seen them all. His narrow mentality cannot appreciate that a full soul must often, quote, overflow into the emptiest of metaphors, close quote. A half-century after Bovary was published, Edith Wharton, whose bold command of language allowed her sometimes to touch the stars that Emma spent her life reaching for in vain, lamented the triviality of her metaphors in a letter to her erratic and careless lover, William Morton Fullerton, a prodigy of her friend and mentor, Henry James, and a sophisticated journalist of vast erotic know-how. After a night of passion, in which the 45-year-old Edith had exposed more of herself than she ever dreamed possible, Morton would not be satisfied until she also revealed her innermost thoughts. She begins her letter of compliant revelation by explaining the differences between them, how he had spent his emotional life while she had been carefully hoarding hers. And this is from her letter to Morton Fullerton. And I'm so afraid that the treasures I long to unpack for you, that have come to me in magic ships from enchanted islands, are only to you the old familiar red calico and beads of the clever trader, who has had dealings in every latitude and knows just what to carry in the hold to please the simple native. And I'm so afraid of this, that often and often I stuff my shining treasures back into their box, lest I should see you smiling at them. Close quote. She revealed that when he held her, she could not speak, quote, because all the words in me seem to have become throbbing pulses, and all my thoughts are a great golden blur. Sometime later, recalling Fullerton's careless remark that she had the unfortunate habit of serving up, quote, the stalest of platitudes with an air of triumphant discovery, she vowed never again to permit a romantic excess to slip uncensored from heart to pen. In her mid-40s, Fullerton's critiques could silence her as effectively as her mother's haughty dismissal of the first line of her first attempt at making up a story. The 12-year-old Edith Jones had started off her story with a social nicety about an untidy drawing room, and her mother's only observation was, "Drawing rooms are always tidy." After that chilling commentary, Edith would not risk making up stories again until 3 years later, when she produced a racy novella, Fast and Loose, which she wisely kept secret from her mother and everyone else except her dearest friend, a girl very much like herself, who dared to have intellectual and literary ambitions. But then Edith Jones, composed a mock review that was far more devastating than anything her mother might have offered. And here is her review of her own book. Every character is a failure, the plot a vacuum, the style spiritless, the dialogue vague, the sentiment weak, and the whole thing a fiasco. The next year, her mother, Lucretia Jones, who kept a notebook of her daughter's poetry, saw to it that a volume of her verse did get published. And unlike fiction, which had to be founded on real events and hard facts, verse, after all, represented the vague stirrings of imagination and therefore was a suitable ambition for a girl. And Edith would not publish anything else until 1890, after a decade of devoting herself to dressing up as a proper New York Newport debutante, being courted, getting engaged, surviving the humiliation of her disengagement, surviving the illness and death of her beloved father, getting married, surviving the wedding night and the 3 weeks of non-consummation, surviving the consummation, and henceforth a sexless marriage, and then later a nervous breakdown, and the first of her husband's long series of mental collapses. By 1908, the year she fell in love with Fullerton, she had become an immensely wealthy real estate heiress, a best-selling and highly respected writer of fiction, an intimate of Teddy Roosevelt and Henry James. She was fulfilling her childhood literary ambitions. Moreover, the content of her early short stories and novels made it clear that she had struggled against the entrapments of femininity. She had refused to be only an ornamental object. She had refused to appear as a fragile, innocent, lovely thing. And she had won the first stage of her battle to be true to her powers. But something still held her back from assuming the reins. And how powerless she felt in the presence of Fullerton. She was unable to write. Even reading became impossible, as every page would be covered with his name. Edith determined to get hold of herself, but in the blaze of her passion, there was no longer any self to hold to, and she wrote in her diary, "This pinch of ashes that slips through my fingers, oh, my free, proud, secure soul, where are you?" Now, if a worldly navigator like Mrs. Wharton could so lose her bearings with Fullerton, it is not surprising that Madame Bovary's provincial brain would have been totally befogged by Rudolphe Boulanger, and how confused she was by the mélange of femininities he assigned to her, Madonna, friend, sister, lover, and the day she surrendered to him, Emma, who had never been fully sure of what she was, found her calling, and she thought that she belonged in that lyrical region of adulteresses. Emma found herself by losing herself in a stereotype. She moved from the oppressions of housewife into the tyrannies of adultery. She gave up one standard model only to become another one. But with Rudolph, she felt she had been granted at last, quote, that fever of happiness of which she had so long despaired. And now she would experience passion, ecstasy, delirium. She was enveloped in a vast expanse of blue. Ordinary existence was far away down below in the shadows between the peaks. And Rudolphe Boulanger's words were so sweet they could make Emma cry, and his caresses were so ardent they drove her mad. Emma's protestations of love, her ecstasies, her deliriums, her platitudes were tiresome to Rudolphe, and after a few months he was so bored that he no longer even bothered to summon up sweet talk or ardent caresses. Rudolph's glossy infatuation cannot survive the impact of the real woman. And as the reality of Rudolph's dimming ecstasy dawns on Emma, it acts as a spur to her mad artistry. Quote, and so the immense love affair into which she had plunged was diminishing under her like a bed of water being absorbed into its own sand, and she began to see the mud at the bottom. But she didn't want to believe what she was seeing, and so she redoubled her tenderness. Now, Emma Bovary's conviction that her life was meaningless without Rudolph, her willingness to become merely an extension of him, her desire to comply totally with his wishes and desires, her disavowal of the muddy bottom that was belied by Rudolph's majestic phallus, is common enough in certain women's attitudes toward the men who survive on their slavish adoration. Provincial housewives succumb willingly to their thraldom. Great novelists swallow their marvelous words and turn to ashes in the presence of the men who inflame their souls. And this subservience and submissive dependency on an idealized authority, an expectable attitude of a child toward the parents, when it becomes a pronounced feature of an adult relationship, is tantamount to a perversion. By now, the extremely submissive woman is legendary. During the last decades of the 20th century, women who are slaves of love have been coming for therapy with increasing frequency, and books that describe the plight of women who love too much, or women who persist in falling in love with the wrong kind of man, are runaway bestsellers. Now, the extremely submissive woman has been liberated to explore the depths and range of her spiritual and sexual dependencies with any man she chooses. And when the extremely submissive woman first tells her story to her therapist, she reports that her soul has been burned to ashes by her passion for a man who, because he grants her extraordinary sexual pleasure, has been elected as the only right kind of man to penetrate her vagina. And in these early moments of therapy, the question to the therapist seems to be, is that pleasure permitted or forbidden? The focus immediately is put on issues of sin and guilt. And however differently she initially presents her plight, each woman is highlighting her quest for sexual pleasure. For the moment, she is hyper-conscious of her feelings of guilt about all this, but the torment, the abuse, and the humiliation she suffers are experienced as incidental or secondary features, the unfortunate side effects of seeking sexual pleasure. If these torments could only be eliminated, it would no longer interfere with the woman's capacity to obtain full sexual pleasure. If only I didn't have to suffer so for love. At first, the woman is not at all aware that her torment, her humiliation, is an essential ingredient of her sexual pleasure, that she actively creates situations that will torment her. She tortures herself by imagining her lover with other women. She lives in dread because she leaves evidence of her love affair for her husband to discover. She lets slip out the words and phrases that are guaranteed to invoke her lover's contempt or rage. She evaluates the goodness in her life as worthless and pitiful, so that she can come to her magnificent lover in a state of worthlessness and deprivation. It takes time for her to recognize that she seeks her torment with dedication, that she must abase herself, remain in a state of humiliating subjection, so that her lover can remain in his position of domination. Horrorkeit, like all perversions, is a full-time occupation. The woman, afflicted with extreme sexual submissiveness, lives only for her moments of ecstatic love, the sexual union in which the man's mighty phallus confirms the outlines of her feminine self. Otherwise, she is enormously self-critical. She sees herself, for instance, as fat and sloppy. Her legs are too short, her nose too long. She never knows how to dress right. Her haircut, she believes, is shabby and dull. Her work is nothing much. She is socially inept and intellectually dishonest. She is quick to acknowledge that she is nothing without her lover. She speaks of her lover's erect penis the way the male fetishist speaks about his lover's pink satin slippers or blue velvet bathrobe. With it inside her, the penis, or potentially inside her, she feels complete and whole and good and electrifyingly alive, convinced that she, as herself, worthless and defective as she believes herself to be, could not possibly be loved, that only a phallic being is deserving of love. She visits her friends, plays hostess at her dinner parties, comes to her therapy sort of armed with her lover between her legs, and she shows him off. As much as she is longing for compassion and understanding, she is convinced that only power and domination make a person valuable, and it is better to display with pride her defiance of the moral order, better to torment and dominate those who care about her by exhibiting her terrible plight than to admit how frightened she is, how really frightened she is of being abandoned. As the slave of love knows all too well, love can always be taken away, but power is eternal. What she's been waiting for all day is the reunion with her great man, who might, just might, see her for 1 hour later that evening. When she is separated from her lover, the slave of love feels as though she does not exist, as though she resides in a dreary, empty world. Without him, the terrible anxieties, the depression, and the madness that she is always keeping at bay threaten to become conscious. And at the beginning of such an attachment, the woman will experience only a mild apprehension of doom and attribute these feelings to her sinfulness, her need for secrecy, her guilt at having a clandestine affair. Later on, the experience of torment and the sense of impending disaster begin to take on serious and devastating proportions. Separations from her loved one bring on feelings of panic. When she is separated for too long from the man that resurrects her being, the slave of love succumbs to a nameless and terrible dread. But then, sooner or later, there is always the magical reunion, the restitution of a feeling of worth and well-being, of being alive. And not infrequently, after the first days or months of ecstasy, the man pretends disinterest or in fact becomes actually impotent and bored with sexual intercourse. The man becomes, is it already 45 minutes? The man becomes aloof and distant. In situations of sexual bondage, it is not unusual for sexual intercourse to become less and less central to the relationship, and after a while, sex is practically non-existent except as a facilitator of her humiliation. A heightened eroticism plays a considerable part in the initial phases of her bondage, but finally, it is not her lover's capacity to provide erotic pleasure that binds the woman to him, but his ingenuity in creating situations of submission and domination. This is a quote from Bovary. With the shrewdness of those who hold themselves aloof in any relationship, Rudolph soon desired to develop more interesting pleasures in his affair with Emma. He came to feel that ardent words and subtle approaches were tiresome. He began to treat Emma coarsely. He induced her into a total compliance and made her into something corrupt. And she remained hypnotized by a kind of idiotic infatuation, full of admiration for him, a blissful torpor, and her soul, sinking into that intoxication, shriveled and drowned. The longer the man refuses or is unwilling or disinterested, the greater his emotional distance, the longer his disappearances, the more valuable he becomes to the slave of love. The more he neglects her or threatens to leave her, the more the woman submits to his power, the more profound her feelings of loss and despair, then the more ecstatic the reunion with her great man. The woman allows herself to be lowered into a state of abject humiliation, despair, and panic in order for her to be resurrected into a state of sexual ecstasy. And by granting or withholding his penis, the man enables and facilitates these cycles of castration and restitution, abandonment and mystical reunion, death and resurrection. Now, why would any woman put up with such conditions? Why do so many women stay in a relationship with a man who repeatedly humiliates and abuses? It is very hard to believe that a woman entrapped in a scenario of sexual bondage, extreme sexual submissiveness, would not accept kindness or tenderness or satisfaction or pleasure without torment if it was offered to her. However, what we are observing in these scenarios entails a force more powerful than the quest for pleasure. Nor is the woman seeking pain either. The manifest erotic pleasure and the psychological pain of bondage lead the observer astray. The latent elements in a perverse scenario cannot be deciphered through a language of pleasure and pain, a language of desire and fulfillment. Perverse performances are about desperate need. The actors in these perverse scenarios are using penises and vaginas as instruments for playing out repetitive cycles of castration and restitution, abandonment and reunion, death and resurrection. A major difference between perversion and other psychological strategies is that it demands a performance with a scenario. The enactment or performance is designed to help the person to survive, moreover to survive with a sense of triumph over the traumas of his or her childhood. The perverse strategy is unconscious. The actor or protagonist knows only that he or she feels compelled to perform the perverse act, and when they are deterred from doing so, they feel anxious, desperately panicky, agitated, crazy, and even violent. The protagonist does not recognize that the performance is designed to master events that were once too exciting, too frightening, too mortifying to master in childhood. The performer cannot and dare not remember these terrible events. Instead, life is given up to reliving them, albeit in a disguised symbolic form. An adult, male or female, who is compelled to perform a perverse ritual expends a great deal of energy and devotes a considerable portion of each day and night attempting to master and control emotions that were overwhelming and uncontrollable in childhood. A perversion, for as long as it lasts, a decade or an entire lifetime, is a central preoccupation of the person's existence. In extreme sexual submissiveness, the scenario that is being played out with penises and vaginas is an adult version of the there it goes, now it has come back game of infancy. However, now in adulthood, that wonderful childhood game has assumed a quality of fixity and desperation. There comes a point in every childhood, usually around the age of 18 months, that the little child becomes aware of the uncontrollable comings and goings of her mother. And while the child sometimes feels that she cannot go on existing without the mother comes and goes as she pleases. The little girl wants to be able to tolerate her mother's disappearances without having to cry and protest like a little baby. So she invents a game that enables her to feel that she has some control over the cycle of loss of love and return of love. At first, she still needs her parents to participate in the game. She takes all her toys and throws them one by one into corners, under beds, behind doors, so that the whole family has to get involved with hunting for her toys, picking them up, and returning them to her. As she played this game, one little girl would give out with an ooh, voicing the pleasure and satisfaction she got from hiding her toys and having people find them. The mother realized that the inarticulate ooh was her little girl's way of saying gone away. A few months later, as the little girl had learned how to play the game on her own, her mother watched and understood more. Each morning, before her mother and father went to work, the little girl would play with a wooden toy wagon on a string. The girl did not pull the toy along behind her, as the toy was supposed to be used. She threw it over the edge of a couch and watched it disappear with a mournful but excited ooh, and then slowly pulled it back toward her and watched it reappear with a joyous bah. For a while, the gone and back game was more important to this little girl than food or cuddling or fun and games with her parents. And then as the little girl got used to the idea that loved ones would go away but always come back, the game stopped and the wooden wagon was pulled along behind her in a light-hearted, playful way, and the ordinary life of pleasure and pain went on. Now, the difference between the childhood game of gone back, gone away, come back, and the adult game of extreme submissiveness is that the latter is deadly serious and unending, and as I said, a full-time preoccupation. Moreover, the cycles that are repeated in the adult enactment, by virtue of their being played out with genital organs and not little wagons on a string, are highly eroticized and heavy with moral implication. The adult gone away, come back game is about a love that was once given and a love that was taken away, but in circumstances that were so overwhelming that the child could not make sense of the loss or master it. Ordinarily, growing up consists of a series of emotional losses that are compensated by a series of gains. First, in the land of milk and honey, the average little baby is given the kind of nearly unconditional love that infants typically evoke from their caregivers. The mother mirrors everything the baby does in a way as to enable the baby to feel that the baby has created the world around her. In the average family, there is an understanding between parent and child that the loss of mirroring love will be compensated for by the acquisition of a new kind of love and pride and sense of power. Slowly and surely, the average child gives up some parts of herself that once made her feel grand and powerful and exchanges them for other qualities that are more in keeping with the social order in which she lives. For some children, however, the ones who got just enough mirroring love to survive and to become human, but seldom as much as they were yearning for and seldom at the right time or in the right place, the loss of a love that once was is senseless, and they cannot comprehend why once or once in a while or every so often they experience some moments of mirroring admiration, but now the parent no longer applauds the things they once in a while loved the child for. As she tries to figure out why she has been dropped like this, why she has been cast away, why this terrible thing has happened to her, a little girl cannot imagine that it is due to some weakness or failure or cruelty or ugliness in her mother or father. It must be because she has been bad, because she is worthless, and because she has committed some terrible crime. And from then on, the child is always asking herself, what is this terrible crime? What awful thing did she do or wish to do that makes her deserving of her banishment from the land of milk and honey? Why were her powers taken away? What were they? Where are they? She does not feel compensated for any of her terrible losses. She is convinced that her parents no longer love her because she is stupid, mean, ugly, a creature of no value at all. And when such a little girl grows up into womanhood, she feels she is nothing at all. And if she does have any powers, she makes sure she keeps them hidden, or they will once again be stolen from her. And when she grows up, she sneaks a dirty, clandestine pleasure in a scenario that repeats the cycles of losing love and refinding love. And each time she has sex, it has to be a crime, and another attempt to understand the crime she thinks she committed as a child. And each time, the sex is an act of vengeance on the ones who gave their love and then took their love away. And each time, she awaits the terrible punishment that will surely come. And she seeks over and over again to make sense of the senseless losses she experienced as a child. It'll be about 15 more minutes, okay? I understand we're supposed to stop at 10. Is that right? Okay. A woman who starts out with the sense of her own worthlessness can only find pleasure in a fantasy of being part of a more powerful personality and of overcoming her inadequacy in this way. But such idealizations...
I just want to say, I thought this was a talk. You're reading word for word from the paper. I think it's the easy way out to cheat us. That's why most people are walking out.
Okay. A woman who is convinced of her own worthlessness can only find sexual pleasure in a fantasy of being part of a more powerful personality and of overcoming her inadequacy in this way. But such idealizations can only breed envy. For if a woman feels that she cannot survive unless she is attached to some idealized phallic being, sooner or later she will resent and envy his power. And then there are moments of violent rage when the woman becomes conscious of her extraordinary resentment and envy toward the man who has the power to give or deny her his magnificence. How much in this extraordinary power he resembles the almighty parents who also gave but then denied her their love, who went away but then abandoned her and never came back until she was desperate. But her great man, whom she has endowed with absolute power, the power of an almighty parent, an omnipotent God, is typically exploitative and narcissistic, and very often an experienced con artist who thrives on his power over such women. The tyrant seems to know, consciously or unconsciously, just how to maintain that exquisite balance between promise of love and threat of loss of love that keeps the extremely submissive woman in a state of entrancement. And she will cooperate with him by denying to herself any piece of reality that might belie his magnificence. Whenever there is a threat that her great man might begin to resemble an ordinary man with ordinary strengths and weaknesses, the slave of love will do everything within her power to reestablish his magnificence. And despite the unconscious envy that would destroy him, her God must be kept in his position of power. For he confirms who and what she is, and he knows just how to maintain the cycles of love lost and love regained. And one way of keeping a tyrant in power is to imagine that he might choose another slave. And this fantasy of the rival slave, what she looks like, where she lives, what she does, and how she does it, becomes another torment. But it keeps the Almighty One glowing with power. A tyrant must always be potent, or the slave feels abandoned. A Rudolph can only retain his position of domination through an Emma. And when the slave of love begins to see the muddy bottom, she will do everything she can to keep the tyrant's image pristine. And reality is a sorry adversary of the fantasy of union with the perfect man who mirrors everything the woman wishes to be. And the muddy bottom can always be camouflaged by a fantasy of the eternally erect phallus, which in her mystical union with him she imagines as belonging to both of them. Extreme submissiveness is an expression of a prevailing and enduring social mythology about the respective powers of males and females. The special kind of perfection these women strive for is a perfection that can only be achieved through having intercourse with a superstar, a man with a huge brain, a huge amount of money, a huge reputation, a huge penis. Nor does it matter if reality confirms these attributions of hugeness and infallibility. If the man does not actually possess them, the social order has fetishistic images enough for any man to become the perfect phallus for any woman. Any man in uniform might do, a general, a fireman, a policeman, a judge, depending on the unconscious appeal that a social stereotype of masculinity holds for the woman. The continually erect penis could be attributed to a black man, an Italian man, an Irishman, a rabbi, a priest, a crippled man, a man covered with tattoos, a man with a patch over one eye. For the phallus of the great man has been imagined and fabricated by the woman with as much dedication and passion as it takes to compose a symphony, paint a painting, direct a play, or invent a machine, and any talent which the woman may possess but is afraid to expose to the world. The feature that defines Wharton's affair with Fullerton as perverse, rather than as simply a grand passion, was her insistence on her worthlessness and her willingness to accept his tyranny over her. Why did Edith Wharton insist so that her treasures were nothing at all? Why did she swallow her lovely words in deference to a man who she realized had so little capacity to appreciate the poetry of love? And we ask, why do so many modern women insist that they have no wings to soar, that they are crippled and castrated, that they are nothing? The slave's bondage to her master is in part a cover story. The perversion of sexual bondage brings into the foreground the social stereotype of feminine submissiveness, but it is done in order to assuage anxiety and to keep other shameful and forbidden crimes hidden. One of the reasons the extremely submissive woman is so frightened of her powers is that she associates power with trickery and betrayal, and with rebellion and defiance, and with sadism and domination. In these glorifications of her suffering and worthlessness, we suspect that underneath the cover story, someone is paying for stolen treasures. Someone is keeping hidden the delicious powers that everyone assumes she has given up forever. We frequently discover that the slave of love has all along been developing and acquiring another life. All the time she has been suffering from her erotic enthrallment to the great man, she has been making lots of money in her business, becoming a successful doctor, preparing hundreds of paintings, and delivering lectures on microbiology. Now, these powerful and masterful activities would arouse massive anxiety if there were not some appeasement of the gods. And there is an enormous guilt at having surpassed her parents, those mighty gods who have taken love away, who had the power once to take love away. If a woman had a mother who drudged her life away slaving in the kitchen or in the family candy store, she is not supposed to make a fortune as the owner of a gourmet food shop, for surely she would be abandoned unless she paid for this terrible crime. A truly feminine woman is allowed to passively submit to her faithless lover, but she is not allowed to become a neurosurgeon while her father is a pharmacist and her two brothers are simple country doctors. And I talk mainly about how under the cover story of the suffering life, another secret life is always being sneaked in. And we know that this is true certainly with Edith Wharton, who while she was enthralled with Fullerton, was preparing to write Age of Innocence, for which she won the Pulitzer Prize. Strictly speaking, the Horikite, extremely submissive scenario is neither particularly female nor male. The attitude of extreme submissiveness which Emma Bovary assumed in her affair with Rodolphe was a hiding place for her masculine ambitions. Charles Bovary, her husband, who craved to lose himself in sexual bondage to Emma, who would dominate him with her cold and haughty unavailability, was looking to fulfill his feminine wishes. And since it is a central aim of the perverse strategy to disavow the differences between the sexes, who is the humiliated child? Who is the almighty parent? Who is on top? Who is on bottom? Whether the penis or the vagina is the magical phallus, who is masculine and who is feminine are arbitrary. The roles are interchangeable, and the submissive one is always identifying with the powers of the dominating one, and the dominating one is fulfilling in the submitting one the parts of himself or herself that are forbidden and dangerous and shameful. Now, while these sorts of cross-gender, cross-generational fantasies are present consciously or unconsciously in every sexual relationship, what we witness in a perversion is a tyranny of gender roles, an imperative, repetitive, stereotyped scenario in which masculine wishes must masquerade in a caricature of submissive femininity, and feminine wishes must disguise themselves in a caricature of masculine virility. The male perversions, fetishism, transvestism, exhibitionism, voyeurism, sexual masochism, sexual sadism, pedophilia, zoophilia, necrophilia, put the spotlight on unusual or bizarre sexual activities, so-called kinky sex, as a way of triumphing over the traumas of childhood. In a male perversion, the strategy admits into consciousness a defensive, phallic narcissistic exaggeration of masculinity because most males feel elated, alive, energized, and proud of themselves when they are conforming to this prevalent social stereotype of masculinity. However, macho genital prowess and the impersonation of fantasized, idealized males are always hiding places for the man's humiliating feminine strivings. These caricatures of masculinity, based as they are on prowess, aggression, and domination, simultaneously give some semblance of orderly expression to what would otherwise be experienced as a terrifying primitive violence. For in a male perversion, intercourse is risk, erection is deception, and ejaculation and orgasm are more a trial of survival than a quest for pleasure. Perversions among females have gone relatively unnoticed because the manifest activities will be different according to the gender stereotype the female is striving to achieve, which may, but often does not include a conscious striving for sexual excitement and performance. Women who are involved in the enactment of a female perversion do have a sexual life, sometimes an extensive one, sometimes a limited kinky one, sometimes a totally impoverished one, and this sexual life will figure in her perversion. However, the perversion itself is meant to deceive as to the forbidden elements in that sexual life. So while modern societies theoretically allow for more flexible gender roles than traditional societies, they turn out to be, in their political and economic structures, religious rituals, doctor-patient relationships, advertisements, and so on, to perpetuate the sex role stereotypes that are the major hiding place for the perversions. And so ingrained are these gender ideals that males and females grow up believing that the intellectual approaches, social roles, and bedroom positions they assume as adults are matters of biological destiny. And both sexes are burdened with the infantile ideals of sexual prowess demanded of men and the sexual innocence and submissiveness demanded of women. And so, while the male perversions will manifest as forbidden sexual acts that impersonate and caricature adult genital performance, the analogous female perversions would manifest in behaviors that impersonate and caricature a feminine gender ideal: cleanliness, innocence, spirituality, submission. Thank you. I'm sorry, I assumed I was supposed to read a paper. I would have been very happy to talk. Anyway, if you have some questions, I'll talk now.
First of all, you don't have to apologize to us. We're the ones that didn't mind.
Okay.
They all left.
Right.
I'm curious how, relative to other presenting to other states, how easy or how difficult it is to make headway in therapy with female perversion.
All right. Perversions are an extremely difficult to treat, because and one of the things that makes them difficult is that people the therapist I'm talking about now gets caught up in a moralistic attitude and gets caught up sometimes in the attitude of wanting to cure the perversion. And the minute you do that, you're lost, because the idea is not to feel that it's something the person has to get rid of, but rather to begin to uncover. I tried to give you a picture, it's very hard to do, of the layers that are, I mean, the perversion is a cover story, in males also. It's a cover story very often for the kind of sense of loss that I'm talking about. And you have to create an environment where the person can begin to remember and recollect what has been traumatic for them. And so what makes it extremely difficult is if it's very hard for people to not get caught up in wanting to cure something, which of course very often is threatening to the person's life. And you want very much for them to stop. I mean, the people lose all their self-respect. They sometimes lose, their families, because this really does become a full-time preoccupation. And I think it requires enormous patience and enormous not being moralistic is really the key here. Yes?
The therapist can't point out incredibly obsessive behavior without making noise.
Well, a perversion. Oh, I'm sorry. This woman was asking, how come a doctor can't point out that something is a compulsive behavior. Well, I think when people come to therapy with symptoms, right, and the symptoms are always covering a whole lifetime. And so the idea, it's like, there's a joke about this. If somebody comes to the therapist because they tear paper, and the therapist says, well, don't tear paper. I mean, you can't, this is not the approach to it. Because every symptom is a cover for a whole layers of other things. And if you deal with the uppermost layer, you may cure the symptom, but the patient will still be plagued by anxiety, depression, everything. Their demons are still going to be there. Yes, sir. Yeah, it's a preoccupation. It's a preoccupation, and it consumes their life. And the other thing that I have often discovered, which I mentioned, is that the person feels that anything good that comes to them is a crime. And so they have been developing while the whole time they're in therapy, another life, which they have begun to create. And this other life eventually becomes something that they can tolerate and that they can live with. But, well, they've been saying they're very worthless and nothing at all without their love. I'll use just extreme submissiveness, that they're nothing at all without the perversion. And one of the reasons they feel this way is because they have felt their whole life that it's a crime to succeed. It's a crime to do better than your parents. If your parents were concentration camp survivors, for example, you're not supposed to live. So very often while they're in therapy, to the whole world, it looks like they're throwing their life away because that's how it's supposed to look. But in fact, they are going to school. They are the life of power, real power, is going on and developing. But if you keep your focus, if the therapist keeps the focus on the perversion, and is intent on curing the perversion, they don't allow this other life to flourish. And I don't think the issue should be that a person should be rescued from the desperate fixity of the symptom. Yeah. I'm sorry, did you want? Yeah, let him finish, and then I will get about you. Are you a therapist? No. Oh, you sound like one.
Well, this is empirical, observations. And I'm asking you, have you found in your practice whether when their life does expand and the preoccupation is not as open, does the sexual submissiveness and this whole scenario that we create, does that disappear, does it diminish, or do you find that they can cope with it?
No, it does diminish. I'll answer the question. It diminishes, and in some people they really, because the idea is that underlying it is a depression, terrible anxiety, And yes, of course, yes, they do. Sure. Sure. Sorry. All right. Not except for sexual masochism, right? Sexual masochism is a perversion that people always attribute to women, but actually, it's 20 males to 1 female. That's what males are sexual masochists, not females, all right? For the other perversions, like fetishism, transvestism, necrophilia, and so on, the spread is even bigger because the ratio is about 99 to 1, right? So perversions are extremely rare in women. But as we talk about perversions, because perversions have always been defined by the standard of the male perversions, because people have only been looking at the behavior, right? They look at the deviant sexual behavior of men. And in fact, the perverse strategy is exactly the same in men and women, but the gender stereotype that is expressed in the perversion is different. But actually, the statistic 20 to 1 is sexual masochism, which is mostly in males. Yes? Uh-huh. In mass, I would say, yeah, I believe, I was trying to present an irony throughout all of this, that perversion is an outcome of gender normality, you see. And the insistence, the liveliness of gender role stereotypes in the social order, you know, that there are tops and bottoms, the submissive ones, the dominating ones, the insistence on gender orderliness in children. No, I couldn't. I'm sorry. But, I mean, that's the general idea. I think there are enough people who do object to sex role stereotyping, and that's what I'm talking about. Because the perversions thrive on sex role stereotypes. Did I? No. No. I don't work in the schools, but if you do, I think it's an important thing to do. But it's all around us. The entire society is full of, it's in movies, it's in doctor-patient relationships. There's a top and a bottom, and a dominant one, a submissive one. The entire structure of the social order depends on these. Yeah. And of course, I do a lot of work with parents and children. That's what I do. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Well, any sexual or any relationship, let me put it this way, any relationship that is a preoccupation where you cannot, where you attribute to the other person such an idealization that you feel you are nothing without that person, and that you can't survive without them. The alternative to that is that you shouldn't regard any human being that way. The alternative is that you have a sense of your worthiness, and you don't put anybody. First of all, it isn't even kind to the other person to put them in such an idealized position, because nobody can live up to it. And so I think extreme idealization of somebody is certainly it's not good for the relationship. By the way, I don't like to use terms like healthy or unhealthy, because I think that goes along with this whole idea of, you have to cure people of their mental illness. I mean, I'm not that kind of therapist. I don't believe that there are healthy people and unhealthy people. I thought what I was writing about is...
Thanks for listening. For more information on the 92nd Street Y, New York, and all of our programs, please visit us at 92ny.org.